Today is Sunday, March 8th, the 12th anniversary of the disappearance of MH370, which I feel like is becoming less and less of a thing as years go by. It seems especially deflationary this year, since we've just realized that there might not ever be another Seabed search again. But do not despair. We are still on the case, and with implacable determination, we will solve it. We are making progress every day. Today is an excellent example. I'll be continuing my series on the three unshakable pillars of certainty that underlay the now abandoned Seabed search. This time, looking at whether the Inmarsat data was as rock solid as supposed. And I have very interesting updates concerning two aspects of the case that we discussed last episode. I think you'll find them very intriguing. That's all coming up right now. Hey everybody, Jeff Wise back with you for another episode of Finding MH370, the only show where we dig deep into the technical data with the help of leading subject matter experts from around the world. We are going to solve aviation's greatest mystery. Now, one of those experts who's weighed in was Paul Kennedy, who was in charge of the Seabed search that was carried out from 2014 to 2017. You'll recall that last episode, number 52, I responded to a comment that Paul had made on the show page in which he was objecting to how I characterized the ATSB's sense of certainty. I invited Paul on the show at the time, and this is how he responded in the comment he left to the YouTube video. He wrote, quote, "Thanks for the acknowledgement. Much appreciated. I remember Tony," meaning Tony Abbott, the Australian Prime Minister, wanted to announce we had found it at a UN meeting around New Year's Eve, and I said we were not so sure. Thank the Lord we held off, as it turned out to be a wooden ship of very similar dimensions as the fuselage. Undertaking a detailed search to a high standard is not easy. There is complexity involved when working with 6,000 meter water depth for long periods. Even reviewing the data to be certain we have not misinterpreted it is hard. We worked with IBM Watson AI on that. That's 2015. I was hoping the good folks at Ocean Infinity would locate the aircraft and close this out. If they formally conclude the search process, then I will have a lot more to say on the matter. For me, this remains unfinished business. Well, thank you, Paul, for that. Definitely will be waiting with keen ears to hear your thoughts when you're ready to share them. Parenthetically, Fugro actually found a couple of shipwrecks. In May of 2015, the New York Times ran a story about how they found a shipwreck that seems to have largely disintegrated. The story quoted Kennedy as saying that while the ship was not what they were hoping to find, quote, "It's given us a great deal of confidence. It shows we were able to find small pins and small pieces of metal on the seafloor a long way down. Pieces of MH370 would be roughly 10 times as big as that." Then in December of that year, they found the shipwreck that he mentioned in his comment. It was pretty much intact. You can see how the sonar data reviewers might have, felt a bit of a tremor of excitement when that image came across their screens. Let's move on to the other update that has to do with measurement of Lepus barnacles. You'll remember that also in last episode, I said that of the dozens of pieces of debris that have been collected that have washed up that seem to be connected to MH370, only two have undisturbed populations of Lepus antitifera goose barnacles growing on them. One of them, of course, being the flaperon. That was studied in a lot of detail. But the other one's barnacles were removed before it was collected. It's kind of a strange story. The only reason that we know it had barnacles was that a beachcomber who was strolling along one morning happened to take a picture of it. Notice that it was this strange thing, took a picture. It had barnacles on it as it lay there on the sand. Then it got washed back out to sea, came back in. By the time when it was discovered a second time, it doesn't have any barnacles on it. So we have two images, one with barnacles and no ruler, and the other with a ruler but no barnacles. In principle, we should be able to use photogrammetry to measure the barnacles between the two images. But it's tricky because the piece is curved, certainly beyond my pay grade. I put the question out to viewers. I was asking if anybody could help. And once again, the cavalry came to the rescue. A viewer named Michael Reiser asked me to send him some copies of the images. I did. He studied them. He wrote back to me. He said, I passed this question and images to a few buddies of mine, and we all came to the same conclusion. The logo stripe of the border outline, measured on the cleaned piece and using the provided ruler, is roughly 1.65 centimeters wide. Using the border as a base measurement with perspective correction on the beach image, a rough measurement for the Barnacle can be made. The good thing is the piece is only roughly 50 centimeters wide and shot on a fairly long 70 millimeter focal length. There is very little difference in scale front to back. The barnacles in the foreground are the only clear ones to measure. When measuring a little bugger, it has to be nearly parallel to the image plane, so not all of these can be measured. This is an image that he sent showing the reference length. It's the number in yellow, and the length of the barnacles derived from it. The longest that he found was 2.6 centimeters. Now, as he points out, he wasn't able to measure all the barnacles on this part of the image, let alone on the whole image, let alone all of the barnacles that were on the object. So I think it's quite likely that the longest barnacle of all of them is probably bigger than this. I myself spent some time doing similar photogrammetry on the Lepus from the flaperon that the French investigators let out. There are a lot of those barnacles where the biggest was 2-point-something centimeters, roughly this size. So it's very plausible to me that this population on the Roy piece could be similar, more or less, to that found on the flaperon. And if you compare that to the population that was found on the Zanzibar drifter buoy, which lived in a similar patch of ocean, 10 months in the water, it had a lot of barnacles that were bigger than 3 centimeters, so visibly bigger than these, which makes me wonder if both the flaperon and the Roy piece have small barnacles because they've been in the water for less than 6 months, maybe only 3 months. And if so, that would be consistent with the debris planting scenario. Okay. Onwards to the main course. The main topic that I want to talk about today is the second pillar of certainty that convinced the authorities that the plane could only have gone south into the southern Indian Ocean. The first, which we discussed last week, was that pieces of the plane that washed up in the western Indian Ocean, like the ones we've just been talking about, they could only have come from the crash site further east. The second, which we'll discuss today, is that the data they received from the plane's satellite communication system was 100% reliable, could not have been tampered with, so that they could trust the mathematical analysis that told them that it had gone in the Southern Ocean. And the third, which we'll discuss in the next episode, was that a plane can only be flown from the cockpit, and since Zaharie had been locked in there with a much less experienced crew member, he must have been the one who flew it on a suicide mission into the Southern Ocean. As I said last time, if only one of these three ideas is correct, then the plane has to be in the southern seabed. But if all of them are incorrect, then it doesn't have to be. And that would be an explanation for an otherwise pretty baffling reality, namely that the plane is not on the seabed where the math says it should be. We know that because the seabed search has failed. Okay, so let's briefly recap what the Inmarsat data is and how it told investigators where to look. I talked about this in episode 5 of season 1, talked about it more in episode 7 of that season. So if you want to know about this in more detail, I suggest you go back and check out those episodes. I'm going to do a real speed run of the material right now. So as you'll remember, MH370 went electronically dark 40 minutes into its flight to Beijing, did a 180, flew back over the Malayan Peninsula, and was last seen on military radar at 1822 Universal Time, flying to the northwest over the Andaman Sea. Then 3 minutes later, the satellite communication system was turned back on for a reason that no one has ever been able to find a good explanation for. This system could have been used to make phone calls or send texts, but it wasn't. All it did was to connect with a satellite. In the same way that your cell phone will connect with a cell tower, even when it's not making a call or sending a text, it just pings to make the connection in case you want to use it. So in a similar way, this satellite system connected with a geostationary satellite overhead, it exchanged 7 so-called handshakes or pings over the next 6 hours. And these contained metadata that the satellite company Inmarsat stored on its servers in London. Now, there were 2 kinds of metadata that were important for the case. The first kind was called BTO, or burst timing offset. This was a measure of how far the plane was from the satellite at each of these 7 moments. If you plot all of the possible places that a plane could be at that distance, you get a ring or an arc. It looks like this. Using a technique called Bayesian inference, Australian scientists were able to determine what route the plane most likely took such that it would produce those pings. The route looks like this. Now, you'll notice that there are actually 2 sets of routes shown here. One goes into the Southern Ocean. The other is a mirror image that goes north and ends up in Kazakhstan. The reason that there are 2 mirrored routes is that the BTO data is symmetrically ambiguous. For any route that you draw that matches the ping rings, there's going to be another one that's exactly the same, but it goes off in another direction. This is where the second set of data comes in, the burst frequency offset, or BFO. This is a measure of how much the signal that the satellite received from the plane is different from the frequency that the system is supposed to operate at. This is important because if you're a geosynchronized satellite, you're looking down at the Earth below you from 22,000 miles up, half the Earth is stretched below you. There's going to be millions, maybe billions of devices operating on different parts of the radio spectrum. Each of them has to be allocated a very narrow slice of that spectrum so that they can operate and not swamp each other out. And that's a tricky problem for the Inmarsat satellite because, thanks to a phenomenon called Doppler effect, when a transmitter and receiver are moving in relation to one another, that movement affects the frequency at which the signal is received. And a plane is moving at hundreds of miles per hour, so it has the potential to really screw up the frequency that the satellite is getting its signal at. In order to prevent that from happening, there's a box on the plane called the Satellite Data Unit, or SDU, that does something called Doppler Precompensation. What that means is that knowing what the relative velocity is, it changes the frequency it transmits at so that when the satellite gets it, it will be at the correct frequency. So for instance, if the relative motion means that the signal will arrive at the satellite, let's say 10 units too high, some arbitrary number of units too high, it will deliberately send out that signal 10 units lower than normal so that it will arrive with a burst frequency offset of 0. It will arrive, in other words, at the correct frequency.
Nobody does selling better than Shopify. Shopify is the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret, with Shop Pay that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts go abandoned and way more sales going through. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. On the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that Skims uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period for 3 months at shopify.com/Westwood1, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/Westwood1 to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/Westwood1.
So if the system is working properly, then the BFO values should always be 0. But on the night in question, it wasn't working properly. The satellite was actually really old. It was past its planned retirement age. It was low on the fuel that was used to keep it where it was supposed to be. And so it wasn't actually stationary relative to the Earth, it had started to drift and wander, and the system didn't compensate for that. And as a result, the BFO would have looked different depending on whether the plane was flying south versus north. And after they did a lot of math and tried to figure it out, and it took them a week or more, but eventually this told investigators that the plane went into the ocean, went south, it didn't go north to Kazakhstan. Now, the way that the SDU knows how much to change the transmission frequency is by calculating where the plane is relative to the satellite and how quickly it's moving relative to the satellite. And it does that using navigation information that's generated by another system called the IRS, or the Inertial Reference System. Now, the SDU is located in the back of the aircraft, similar to where a shark's dorsal fin would be. The IRS is in the electronics bay, which is in the front of the plane under the flight deck. These two devices communicate over a data bus called the ARINC 629 bus. It's kind of like a hardwired internet. It consists of a braided cable that a whole bunch of devices can clamp onto, and then any one of them can send signals to any other. And in the case that we're talking about, the IRS is sending location and speed data over the ARINC 629 bus to the SDU, which then uses that information to calculate its relative velocity to the satellite, and thence the Doppler precompensation value. What this means, though, is that if there's an attacker who went up to the front of the business class of flight MH370, opened up the hatch to the electronics bay, and went down there, they would have access to the IRS and to the 629 bus that tells the SDU where it is and how fast it's moving. And because of that, a clever attacker could send signals that effectively lie to the SDU. So it sends a signal at the wrong frequency and causes Inmarsat to record a misleading BFO value, all of which is a very long-winded way of saying this data can be spoofed. It can be altered. It can be falsified. I'm not going to get into every detail right now, but the upshot is that if you're sophisticated enough and you know how this system works, you can change the data that the IRS sends to the SDU, and you can make it look to investigators later like the plane went one way when it really went the other. Back in episode 22 of season 1, I talked to Ken Monroe, an aviation cybersecurity expert with the company Pentest Partners in the UK, and he discussed with me the possibility of changing the algorithm inside the SDU box itself. He was skeptical that would work. Maybe he's right, maybe he's not, but what's important is that there's new research that suggests that there's a simpler way to tamper with the BFO values. A 2024 paper called Airbus Hijacking, Silently Taking Over Avionics Systems, written by Martin Strohmeyer and his colleagues from the Information Security Lab in Zurich. They describe the vulnerabilities of the ARINC 429 bus, which is an earlier version of the 629 bus that MH370 used. They describe how it's possible in considerable detail by clamping onto the bus to overwrite signals that one device on the bus is sending to another. Basically, you can falsify any data that you want. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Strohmeyer and his colleagues write, quote, attackers can not only monitor bus communications, but also actively disrupt them through bit flips, packet injections, and cancellation attacks. This research sheds light on the severe risk of undetected data tampering and packet manipulation, which pose a real threat of catastrophic outcomes. They add that the prioritization of functionality and safety has often led to the neglect of security considerations. This oversight leaves critical systems exposed to sophisticated cyber-physical attacks. I've interviewed Martin Strohmeyer before. He helped me with an article that I did for New York Magazine about a different aspect of cybersecurity. I reached out to him to see if he'd come on the show. I also wanted to know if the vulnerability that he identified in the 429 bus would also apply to the 629. He wrote back to me by email, quote, "Our communications people at the DoD are very jittery about something like this for various Switzerland internal reasons. So unfortunately, I have to pass this time. I wouldn't be able to say much beyond what is in the paper. Yes, 629 should work similarly as we allude to in the paper." I think it would be really interesting to put together a paper that builds on Martin's research to specifically detail how exactly a spoofing attack on MH370's Doppler precompensation could be carried out. If there's anybody out there with an aviation cybersecurity chops who'd like to get involved, help me out on that, hit me up. I know that you guys are very busy these days in the aviation cybersecurity business. Lots happening out there in the world right now. But I think it would be a really impactful project. Think about that. All that aside, what I think is really important to understand is that no one has ever really seriously contested the idea that BFO values could be spoofed. Followers of the podcast will know that over the years, I've had a long-running beef with members of the so-called independent group of MH370 experts. They are really reluctant to engage with the idea that MH370 might have been hijacked by someone other than the captain. But even they are on board with the feasibility of a BFO spoof. No less than Victor Ianello himself wrote a very detailed description of how such an attack could be carried out. And back when MH370 disappeared, scientists at Inmarsat publicly wondered if the data might have been altered. In May of 2014, David Coyley, Inmarsat's VP Aviation, appeared at an aviation industry conference in California. He said, quote, "We are very confident that this data is correct, assuming that there is no way this data has been spoofed in any way." He stressed that Inmarsat strongly believes that the spoofing did not occur. The reason that they didn't think that the attack was carried out, the reason that they didn't think the data was spoofed, is that they believed that the work they did to decipher the Doppler precompensation riddle was so difficult that they couldn't conceive that somebody else might have cooked up this hack in order to deceive them on such a subtle piece of evidence. It would mean that they were dealing with an adversary who was smarter than they are. This is how Mark Dickinson, former Inmarsat VP of Satellite Operations, expressed his skepticism in the Netflix documentary series MH370, The Plane That Disappeared.
The idea that someone predicts that we would analyze this data in this way, when we've never done it in the past before, doesn't seem particularly credible at all.
What I actually find really interesting is that he's not saying that this kind of attack is impossible. He's saying that he couldn't believe that someone else could have figured it out before they did. I find that a very weak argument. Zero-day hacks happen all the time. The definition of a zero-day hack is that it occurs when an attacker figures out and exploits a vulnerability before the engineers who built the thing realize that the vulnerability is there. It is absolutely no defense to imagine that there are no bad guys in the world who are smarter than you are. There are a lot of really, really smart bad guys. A really great example of that was the SolarWinds hack, in which Russian state hackers achieved an absolutely devastating penetration of a major American IT management company, effectively turning its own software updates into a Trojan horse. Wired did a really good article about this that came out in 2023. Let me read you one key paragraph that describes the process by which investigators realized how the attack had been carried out. One possibility was that the attackers had stolen the digital certificate, or more alarmingly, they might have breached SolarWinds' network and altered the legitimate Orion.dll source code before SolarWinds compiled it, converting the code into software and signed it. The second scenario seems so far-fetched that the Mandiant crew didn't really consider it until an investigator downloaded an Orion software update from the SolarWinds website. the backdoor was in it. The implications were staggering. Just to draw a line under it, investigators could have missed figuring out how the attack had worked because it seemed too far-fetched that the attackers could have been that sophisticated. When they did eventually realize what had happened, they were stunned by the caliber of their adversaries. They were world-class. Really, it's a testimony to the quality of the investigators in this case, that they had the humility to recognize and to acknowledge the quality of their adversaries. It takes a certain amount of intellectual humility to do that. Contrast that with Mark Dickinson, who says that he doesn't find it plausible that someone could have figured out something like that before Inmarsat did. I find that naive and frankly a bit sad, because I don't think that a top caliber institution would allow itself to be lulled into complacency in this way. What's very apparent right now, in a way that wasn't apparent in 2014, is that we are living in a world in which a powerful actor is on the world stage using a wide variety of attacks, some of them sophisticated, some of them not, but all aimed at undermining the free market democracies of the world. These attacks have been going on and on. They've been incredibly damaging for the well-being of civilization as a whole. And the reason that more has not been done to stop them is that many of the most powerful people who are in a position to stop them simply lack the imagination to understand that the world has entered a new, dangerous phase that does not play by the old rules anymore. And even when danger is staring them directly in the face, they don't see it because they lack the imagination to understand that it could be possible. You know, we hear a lot about conspiracy theories and how people irrationally believe in impossibly complicated, malevolent plots. Well, there's a kind of inverse counterpart, which I call reasonablism, which is the inability to perceive complicated, malevolent plots because they're too far outside your model of how the world works. They don't seem reasonable to you. I want to wrap up this episode by drawing your attention to a remarkable article by Sean Walker that appeared in The Guardian last month, talking about why U.S. intelligence had such a hard time convincing Ukraine and other allies that Russia was about to invade in February of 2022, even though it presented them with just vast amounts of good intel indicating that it was about to happen. Walker quotes Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, on why some European allies did not believe the Americans. Quote, I felt that the evidence we presented to them was overwhelming. It's not like we held back something that, if only they'd seen it, would have made all the difference. They were just seized with the conviction that this simply made no sense. Later, Walker writes, a big psychological block for some European intelligence services was that they believed Putin to be a largely rational actor and were deeply skeptical that he would embark on a plan that they felt was likely to fail. Assessing what we can learn from this brush with disaster, Walker writes, quote, 4 years on, there are many lessons to be drawn from these events about how intelligence is collected and analyzed. Perhaps the most pertinent, as the world appears more unpredictable than at any time in recent history, is that it is dangerous to dismiss a scenario because it seems to fit outside the realm of what is rational or possible. And he adds, for many, the key intelligence lesson from Ukraine was stark. Do not rule things out just because they might once have seemed impossible. The same goes for MH370. Do not rule things out just because they might once have seemed impossible. Think about that. Okay, that's all I have for you for now. As promised, next episode will be about the final leg in the stool of certainty. If you want to get an alert as soon as it drops, sign up for a free newsletter at findingmh370.com. You can leave comments or make suggestions there, also in the YouTube comments section here. And if you really want to help out, you can hit the donate button underneath the video. If you do that, I would be really, really grateful. For now, this is Jeff Wise. I'll see you next time.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.